Welcome to this afternoon's presentation from the Humanities Forum. My name is Pat McFarlane. I teach in the philosophy department and in the Development of Western Civilization course here, and I'm on the Humanities Forum committee. Thank you for joining us on a brisk, beautiful late fall afternoon. I'm going to turn over the introducing duties to Father David Ulrich. Father Ulrich is the director of the Latinx program here. Latinx and Latin American Studies program here at Providence College. And he's also, I'm happy to say, my teammate in teaching the Development of Western Civilization program. Father Ulrich.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Professor Matthew Restall. And Matthew was educated at Oxford and UCLA. He's the Edwin Erle Sparks Professor of Latin American History at Penn State. And since 1995, he has published over 20 books and 60 articles and essays, focusing on 3 areas of specialization: colonial Mesoamerica, primarily the Yucatan and the Maya, Africans in Spanish America, and the Spanish Conquest. His work on Mayan history includes Maya World 1997, and published in 1997, Maya Conquistador, as well as 2 co-authored volumes, Mesoamerican Voices, and 2012, The End of the World, The Western Roots of the Mayan Apocalypse. His books on Afro-Spanish America include 2 edited volumes, Beyond Black and Red, and Black Mexico, plus his monograph, The Middle Africans and Mayas and Spaniards in Colonial Yucatan, won a significant prize for Colonial Latin American History for the best book on Mexican history. And there's a whole list of other books that he's published as well. He's been a scholar and a number of prominent awards. His latest book, which we're going to hear some aspects of it this afternoon, is When Montezuma Met Cortés, A True History of the Meeting That Changed History. Please welcome Professor Restall.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Ulrich. Thank you for inviting me and for having me here. I understand this is Senior Ring Week. I have absolutely no idea what that means, but it sounds fun. And it sounds like something that some of you might rather be doing than being here. Is it fun, or is it starting tonight? Oh, so they should be pre-gaming, is what you're saying. Okay. Well, I don't really get what that is, but a lot of you don't really get what this is either. So hopefully by the time sun goes down and the real gaming begins, we'll understand each other a little bit better. I have a text which I'm going to read, gives me some structure and pace here. I have about 60 images to keep you entertained. If I rattle through my text at high speed, I'll be done in about half an hour, but I'm going to take a little bit longer than that, and there'll be some asides and so on. Nevertheless, there's a lot of information that comes out, and if there are things that you don't understand what I said or particularly interested in, or there's an image that you want to talk more about, do please make a note of it, because there's going to be time afterwards for some Q&A, and I love talking about this kind of stuff. I would happily be here until long after the sun goes down talking about it, and I'm happy to talk about it after the formal session is over for as long as you might want. The spoils of war piled up. Just as quickly the vultures circled. Hernando Cortés felt himself besieged on all fronts. Paranoid and greedy, he scrambled to assemble shiploads of precious metals and stones, Mesoamerican featherwork and cloth, animal skins, and young slaves. One of many shipments was finalized in November of 1527 to be sent to his father, Martin, in Spain. Cortés trusted few men, mostly only his relatives, and those fell in number almost as fast as they arrived in the Indies, as the Spaniards called the New World. The previous year, for example, while Cortés was absent from Mexico City, not yet called that, It was still called Tenochtitlan, but the Spaniards couldn't say that. They called it Temistitan. Cortez's enemies had arrested his two cousins, whom he had placed in charge of the fledgling Spanish colony. One cousin had been slowly tortured to death by fellow Spaniards. The other had been shipped in chains to Spain. Cortez now sent some pieces of gold, a phrase I'm taking from this letter, to help the surviving cousin with his political troubles. But the first item of business was a very different matter. And he began his letter with this. And here I'm translating from the top there. And if you're thinking, well, I thought I could speak Spanish. Maybe I'm even a native Spanish speaker, and I don't, what on earth kind of language is that? That's the orthography or the handwriting that was common in the early 16th century. Sir, he begins, addressing his father, Sir, here in my house there has grown up, since it was very little, a tiger, un tigre. And it has turned out to be the most handsome animal that has ever been seen. For in addition to being very pretty, it's very tame and walks freely about the house and eats at the table whatever it is given. And it therefore seems to me that it could go on the ship very safely and will escape the fate of so many that have thus died. I implore your mercy to give it to His Majesty, as he's asking his father to give it to the king, King of Spain. For in truth, it is booty to be gifted. And the original phrase is es pieza para dar. Pieza or pieza is a Spanish word literally meaning piece, a piece to be presented. It's the word that was used to describe booty of any kind, including human booty, such as slaves. The following year, Cortés himself crossed the Atlantic. Another fortune in plunder accompanied him, as did scores of Nahuas, Tainos, and other indigenous men, women, and children, all illegally enslaved during and after the Spanish-Aztec War. Their destiny was to serve conquistador veterans in their households, or to be sold in the slave markets of Seville and to die an ocean away from their homelands. Also accompanying Cortés was his eldest son, named Martin, after his grandfather. Child was 6 years old. His mother was a Nahua woman, Malinche, or Doña Marina, known to us, most typically, as Malinche, the polyglot interpreter who had acquired status during the war. In 1519, she had herself been a piece of booty to be gifted. Her boy, who she would never see again, was deposited by Cortés at court to be one of the many pages to the future King Philip II. So little Martin was also a piece to be presented. Well, what are we to make of these two pieces of historical evidence? I'm referring to the letter that you saw in a moment and this image here. According to historians, not very much. While Cortés's letter to his father, here it is again, survives in the archives in Seville. I found the original just sitting there. Nobody has really made any use of it. I found some references to it, that's where I knew it was there, but no one has done anything with it. As for this particular version of the many images of the giving of women and of Malinche, it too has been ignored by historians. So perhaps these are just dots that nobody has been able to connect to other dots or seen fit to do so. After all, our job as historians is to explain why things turn out the way they do, and as we already know the outcome, we simply need to look back and connect the dots. Easy, right? Well, there's a problem. In the words of one historian, too many dots. So in the next half hour or so, I'll show you some more dots and suggest how they might lead us from Cortés's tiger and his half-indigenous children to the children of the Aztec emperor, Montezuma, to Montezuma's lions, and hopefully back to that tiger. And some of these dots will be familiar to you, some won't, but hopefully the way that I'm sequencing them will inspire you to see a little differently this crucial moment in the history of the Americas. So, follow me now from central Mexico, where we were there for a minute, 1527, now to this quaint little American town, Columbia, Tennessee, I visited it a few years ago in the course of doing research for the book, whose cover you're going to see in a minute, just to go to this house, the Polk Home and Museum. Why? There's a painting there. You might recognize this bad hombre. He's our tiger owner, Cortés. There are numerous posthumous portraits of him. Actually, there are no portraits done in life. They're all posthumous, and they're pretty much all terrible from an art point of view. So what makes this one significant? It's not really a pretty painting, is it? Well, before hanging in the museum in Columbia, Tennessee, the painting hung in the foyer of the now demolished Polk Mansion in Nashville. There you can see the arrow points to, there's the painting in this photograph taken there in 1891. It was still there in 1891 when Sarah Childress Polk died. She had brought it from the White House back in January of 1849 upon becoming the outgoing First Lady. Thus, for the last year of the Polk presidency, the painting had hung in the White House lobby, where the First Lady made a point of showing it to all visitors. She liked to remark that the US invasion of Mexico was one of her husband's greatest achievements. Quote, among the most important events in the history of this country. This is in the 1840s, not in the 2020s, right? On the day that Sarah Childress Polk hung the painting in her Nashville mansion, she learned of the death of General William Worth, actually from the same cholera epidemic that would kill her husband a few months later. Worth was one of the heroes of the US victory in Mexico. He claimed he saw this original painting in the hospital, or the Hospital de Jesus in Mexico City, and commissioned a copy, which he then sent in 1848 to the First Lady as a gift. I think Worth lied. I think this is an 18th century painting, not a 19th century copy, so meaning he looted the painting. Either way, the general was struck by what he saw as powerful parallels between the invasions of Mexico in 1519 and 1847. He wasn't the only one. US soldiers carried copies of William Prescott's The Conquest of Mexico on their march from Veracruz to Mexico City. The war made that book, published a few years before, a bestseller. Prescott, opposed at first to a war of naked aggression, soon changed his mind when the royalties started piling up. Others rushed conquest-themed novels, romances, and histories to press, typically comparing Scott to Cortés, both having invaded, quote, the same most magnificent of valleys with equal daring intrepidity. US soldiers wrote home that they were walking in the footsteps of the great Cortés. Americans started calling their war the Second Conquest, and Scott asked Prescott to follow his book with one on the Second Mexican War. Just a few years after Scott and Worth styled themselves the new conquistadors, marching into the halls of Montezuma, that's where the expression comes from, leaving a permanent imprint on the American imperial imagination. Another visitor to Mexico City was struck by the imprint of conquest and empire on the urban landscape. Introducing another character here, an Italian, Constantino Brumidi, an Italian painter of religious art. He'd been brought from Rome in 1854 to paint an altarpiece in the cathedral in Mexico City. And while he was there, he frequently visited and sketched the historical sites and monuments that fascinated him, such as that Hospital of Jesus and the great Aztec calendar stone, which if you don't know what that is, we're going to see it in a moment. In Brumidi's day, that was exhibited inside the cathedral, just leaning against one of the pillars. Well, after he was in Mexico City, Brumidi's next commissions were in the United States. And by the end of the 1850s, he had been hired to paint the interior of the Great Dome of the US Capitol in Washington, D.C. Designed in 1859 by Brumidi, but painted by him and two other artists over the course of decades between the 1870s and the 1950s. The frieze of American history, as it is called, still called today, if you go and be one of the many millions of visitors who come to this building. The frieze of American history curves around the base of the dome, 58 feet up from the floor. 19 individual historical scenes comprise the frieze, with the third of them incorporating Bromides' rendering of that Aztec calendar stone as a backdrop to this. Thus, with a tilt of the head and a gesture of the hand, Montezuma capitulates to Cortés in the US Capitol. The surrender, I think, is a subtle one. The Aztec emperor's pose is one of proud welcome, not abject defeat, yet the ramifications of the encounter seem clear. The forward motion of the scene is with the advancing armed Spanish conquistadors. The Aztecs are adorned with feathers, not weapons, and one of three Aztec princesses is on her knees. Furthermore, the scene is a link in the chain of events that mark American history, from Columbus's first landing in the hemisphere to, as conceived by Bromides, that remember he's designing this in 1859, the discovery of gold in California. So this, the third of Bromides' scenes, is echoed on the other side of the dome by the 15th scene. So if you're standing there at the bottom of the dome and you see Montezuma and Cortez and you turn all the way around, you'll see the 15th scene right across. It's a depiction of US troops taking possession of Mexico City in 1847. The parallel is inescapable, and I'll make it easier for you, something you can't do when you're actually standing there very easily. Here we have General Scott is essentially Cortés. General Santa Anna is Montezuma. The two acts of surrender in Mexico City echo, illuminate, and legitimize each other, representing resonant moments in the march of progress and civilization that is American history. This frieze in the Capitol illustrates the simple fact that 3.5 centuries after Cortés met Montezuma, it's not 3.5 centuries till today, we're going to get to that, right? There's 3.5 centuries up to when this was created. Their meeting was still being remembered, represented, and reinscribed as a surrender. The clash of civilizations, the conquest wars, the protracted process of colonization, they're all eclipsed and elided into a single symbolic moment. For Cortés and the West, that moment is providentially triumphal. For Montezuma and Native America, it's one of voluntary capitulation and acceptance of fate. Now, Bromides accidentally left space, a full 30 feet, which is a lot. I have a hard time believing he did it accidentally, but that's the story. So after he died, that meant later artists could update America's history. There was room for them to keep going around the curve of the dome, so that today the final scene is not the discovery of gold in California, but the Wright brothers and the birth of aviation. And because the frieze is a circle, Wilbur Wright is adjacent to Columbus, separated only by an allegorical female America. Yes, there she is in the middle. The woman holding the spear, that's right. She's us. She's America. America as a desirable woman, sometimes topless, sometimes indigenous, has been ubiquitous in the Atlantic world for the past 5 centuries. An icon that I shall return to in a minute, I think, is far less innocuous than she might at first seem. But the 21st century's millions of visitors to the Capitol can gaze up and see Columbus and the Wrights virtually side by side, a circle completed by America, just as they can see the mirrored pairs across the rotunda from each other of Cortés and Scott, Montezuma and Santa Anna. Back to these guys. The impression of the monumental weight of great events, of a predestined sequence of past moments, of facts carved in stone, is irresistible. I've stood in the many hours listening to guided tours and listening to the comments by visitors and tourists as they look up. And that sentence that I just read, which is not in the book, is inspired by witnessing the way that people respond to them. And they don't realize until they are told by the guides that in fact the frieze is not carved in stone. It's a mural. It's painted. It's painted in grisaille, which is a fresco of whites and browns designed to look like stone. Likewise, the frieze depicts a series of encounters that actually took place, but those encounters are styled and juxtaposed to eliminate their ambiguities and complexities, all in the service of this greater message. Thus, the frieze's use of content, like its technique of composition, is an artful trick. We can let ourselves be fooled and accept Montezuma's surrender to Cortés, for example, as a fact carved in stone, or we can open our eyes to the spectacular trickery of a lie that has lived for 5 centuries, surviving like a virus as it moves from image to image, page to page. Let's jump now from Washington, D.C., where Cortez's portrait once hung in the White House, where Montezuma still surrenders to him in the Capitol Dome, back to that hospital, the Hospital de Jesus in Mexico City, visited by Worth and Scott as occupying generals, and Bromidi as a visiting artist. Now, confusingly, a copy of the portrait that they saw that was stolen and sent to Washington still hangs today in the director's office. The hospital is still a functioning hospital. The director's office is not a public space, it's closed. That's my wife that looks like a ghost moving there through the room. We managed to persuade the cleaning lady to let us in while the director was at lunch. And she said with a wink, "He won't be back for a long time." I don't know what kind of lunch. Was it like a 3 martini lunch or whatever it was, but I wanted to stand on that round table in the middle and get a better picture of the portrait. You can see my arrow is pointing where it is on the wall. I was like, don't be crazy. The clean lady might lose her job if we get caught. Just take a picture with your iPhone. It was the earlier generation of iPhone. It's a terrible shot. That's the best I could manage. But it's pretty clear that it's a version of the same portrait that hangs in Columbia, Tennessee. So this hospital, it's a pretty fascinating place. It's the longest functioning hospital in the Americas. It was founded in the 1520s, allegedly by Cortés on the very site where he first met Montezuma in 1519. In 1519, November the 8th. That is 500 years to today. Why am I in Providence College on the 500th anniversary and not, I don't know, where else would I be? Mexico City, for example? Because Father Ulrich invited me before anybody else did. I could say I had dozens of invitations and I picked this one because this is absolutely my favorite place. I was very happy that he invited me and I got to say yes. And then when other people asked me, maybe other places that I would be less interested in going to, or Mexico City where it would be politically complex for me to say the things that I want to say, I was really happy. Like, nope, I'm going to PC. I like it. So this is, in a sense, kind of a special day, right? In another sense, who cares? It's just a day. We should be talking about this on any day. It could be the 499th anniversary. It could be 500 years and 8 days, whatever. It also is exactly 3 years since the last presidential election. Is that a cause for anyone to be celebrating or in mourning, maybe? No, it doesn't really matter. And yet it kind of does, right? It does in the sense of the import of the events and how we're going to make them relevant to what we're talking about. Now, and I'm going to be coming to that. So, this meeting, this book that I wrote was originally called The Meeting. When I first started writing it, I actually first started writing it here in Providence at the John Carter Brown Library. I wanted it to be called The Meeting and to be structured around this encounter. My editor at the press that published the book said, you can't call it The Meeting, people will think it's a book about business. And then when they buy it and it's not about business, they'll be mad. So I gave it a much better title, which people joke. Some of my friends, this gives you a sense of who my friends are. It's like a sequel to When Harry Met Sally. And I was in an airport the other day and happy to see and amazed to see this book in an airport. Right next to it was a People magazine with the cover was the anniversary of When Harry Met Sally, and they're the two things were right next to each other. And I hung around for about 10 minutes to see people coming in. Nobody bought my book, but several people bought the People magazine. So this meeting took place at the entrance to the imperial capital city of Tenochtitlan. This is the first meeting of Cortés and Montezuma. As I call him, he was actually called Montezuma in the 16th century. It's not just a modern English rendering. His full title and name was, and I'll butcher the Nahuatl, but bear with me and you'll see why I don't use this all the way through the book or my talk. Hue Tlatuani Motekusomatsin Shokoyotsin. That's the way that he would have been addressed. Don't abbreviate it. That would be insulting to the emperor. Now, this is one of the great meetings of human history, brought two empires, two great civilizations irreversibly together. The setting for the meeting may have been the most breathtakingly beautiful combination of natural and built environments in human history. Diego de Ordaz, the first person from the old world to see Tenochtitlan, said it caused him fear and astonishment. Cortés enthused to the king that it was so wondrous as not to be believed. That's pretty much all the words that the conquistadors have. They had worked with a limited vocabulary, and for them there were really two reactions: amazement and terror. Cortés's description was soon published in Spain, and it could not do Tenochtitlan justice, of course. A map was also sent to the king. The original map, which is lost, not this, the original one is lost, was probably drawn by an Aztec artist, and it survives in the form of this hybridized rendering. So this is a mixture created by we don't know whom, but there's a mixture drawn from the original Aztec map and then somebody reading Cortés's letters and kind of merging the two together. And on the left there, if you're thinking, what's the other little lake? That's actually the Gulf of Mexico. So there's two separate maps that are often put together in a way that throws you off because of the differences of scale. This map is, to my mind, one of history's great cartographic treasures. Somebody needs to write an entire book just about this map. I could stand here and talk for an hour about this map. There's so much in here. It leads us in so many fascinating directions. I'm going to come back to it later, so I'm just kind of leaving it here like a colored M&M on a forest path, and as part of our kind of trail of dots. I'm going to come back to it later. Whereas Cortés found relatively few words in describing the city, like his fellow conquistadors, he found many when it came to describing the conversation that took place at the meeting. Here's the closest we have to a manuscript version of Cortés's account of that conversation. Montezuma apparently delivered an astonishing speech on November the 8th, exactly 500 years ago today. Even more astonishingly, Cortés wrote that down verbatim a full year later, as if he remembered all 530 words of its Spanish translation. The emperor revealed, apparently, that generations ago, the Aztecs had been guided to Mexico by an ancient lord, who then departed, but whose return they had awaited ever since. Sound kind of vaguely familiar, like a story you've heard somewhere else? Yeah. That return, Montezuma told Cortés, had now come, for the emperor believed the Spaniards to be descended from that ancient lord, and therefore, quote, "We believe and hold as certain that this great lord or king who sent you here is our natural lord, nuestro señor natural." This allegedly is Montezuma talking about the king of Spain. "And therefore you may be sure that we will obey you and hold you as lord." Wow. Now, Montezuma, of course, said no such thing. His words of welcome were deliberately distorted, and restyled as a surrender speech. A year later, after he'd been murdered by the Spaniards, his alleged surrender then became the justificatory cornerstone of 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule. Cortez's narrative became conquest gospel. It survived in visual form as well, described and painted hundreds of times. For example, we go back to that Hospital de Jesus in Mexico City. There it is on a mural on the wall. There's also one on the outside of the building. Jump back up to Washington, D.C., the Library of Congress. This is a very famous set of paintings done in the 17th century. This painting actually hung in a country house in the north of England for centuries, and eventually was discovered and is now on a beautiful display in the Library of Congress. If you're there, take a chance to go see that. There's a nice interactive screen and everything. There are many, many others scattered around the world in books and on walls. They reflect the early modern European imagination. Each of those is from a different century as we move forward, 17th, 18th, 19th century. Tells us a lot about those centuries. Tells us what Europeans, in those eras, Europeans and Americans are thinking about this event. They don't tell us anything about the event themselves. They don't tell us anything about what Tenochtitlan or the Aztecs looked like or what was really happening. Go back to just like this. So if this meeting as a surrender is fake news, an alternative fact, if it's such a whopping great fib, why did it take root so deeply in the 16th century and persist for half a millennium? Right? Because there's a kind of a catch here. If I'm saying this is everywhere for hundreds of years, it's not just the standard narrative that was founded by Cortés in that book that you saw earlier, but it's absolutely everywhere, then how is it that I'm so clever that I figured out what really happened? It doesn't make sense, right? It does not make sense. So there has to be some kind of interrogation of 2 parts to that, which is essentially what I've done in the 180,000 words of that book, is to try to convince you that that's not what happened, but then also to explain why the lie has survived for so long, why it becomes so important. So I obviously can't summarize all of that in the amount of time I have here, so I'm just kind of cherry picking a few things. And I'm going to begin with one reason that might seem a little bit kind of off-kilter. It's in the book, near the end of the book. It's to my mind, kind of one of the most disturbing aspects of this story, and that's why I want to kind of bring it right up front and talk about it for a little while. The Malinche, when I was earlier versions of this talk, or I kind of rewrite these every time I have to talk to people about it, and early on I didn't talk about Malinche at all. Doña Marina Malintzin, I introduced her right at the very beginning. But I found that in Q&A, often people would say, oh, this is somebody I know about. What about Malinche? What about Malinche? And it's going to come up more when Netflix releases the Steven Spielberg version of these events called Montezuma. Yep, based on a script by Dalton Trumbo written in the 1960s. We were talking about this at lunch. And this is, I fear, is going to resurrect a 19th century, really late 18th, early 19th century version of this story in which Malinche and Cortés have a great romance. So popular images of the gift of Malinche to Cortés deny the violence that lay at the heart of the Spanish invasion, the war it provoked and its aftermath, massacres of whole towns, mass enslavement of millions of women and children across Mesoamerica in the 1520s, 1530s, and 1540s. Warfare that might arguably be termed genocidal. That's a very weighted term, but I throw it out there as not necessarily as a final conclusion or judgment, but more as something to be debated, might arguably be termed genocidal, meant that the need to justify conquest became more, not less pressing after the fall of the Aztec Empire. Just because that war is over doesn't mean to say that that violence can be forgotten about it and buried. It becomes more and more of an issue as the generations pass. So this, the darkest side to conquest and colonization in Mesoamerica, and I'm talking about the trafficking in indigenous girls as sex slaves, needed to be covered up. The solution? Surrender. Not just of Montezuma, but surrender in a larger sense, in a gendered and metaphorical sense. We're accustomed to seeing the early modern era as one of imperial expansion, of conquest and colonization, terms that evoke images of military encounters, of church building, of statecraft, and cultural accommodations. But consider the experience of indigenous women, hundreds of thousands of them from Calusa, Maya, Mixtec, Muisca, Nahuatl, Taino, Tocobaga, and other indigenous communities were grabbed on shores, dragged from homes, or simply presented to their Spanish, Portuguese, or English captors. Colonial Spanish laws often reveal not what was done in compliance with the law, but what had been done so widely that a legal attempt was made, usually in vain, to stop it. That's the disturbing context behind a 1534 royal edict that indigenous slaves should be at least 14 years old. For the majority of enslaved indigenous women who appear in the imperial Spanish historical records testified that they were taken from their homes and sold when they were children or young girls. Accurate numbers of enslaved indigenous children are impossible to obtain for the very reason why their stories have been absent from the historical record. Their captivity was almost always illegal. They were always removed from their home communities, often taken thousands of miles away. And as children, they had no legal recourse and few ways to remember their origins. So the testimonies that have survived are important and deeply disturbing. For example, I can only have time to give you one example. A woman who is simply known as Isabel la India, Isabel the Indian woman, testified in the Spanish port city of Cádiz in 1554, when she was about 30 years old, that she was taken from her home village in Mexico, quote, "And I was brought to Spain by way of Veracruz and Havana when I was about 15, still a child, a young girl. And the boatswain sold me to another boatswain, and then to a ship captain who was Portuguese. And we docked in Lisbon, where I was sold to a Portuguese slave merchant who brought me to Cádiz." Imagine the sheer terror experienced by Isabel and thousands of other girls taken by force from their homes, shipped around the Americas or across the Atlantic Ocean, distributed among Spanish men whose sensibilities had been made dull by years of combat and slave raiding. Most of the captives were younger than 15, more typically 12 years old, as was Malinche. Some, like Malinche and her fellow captives, were bartered by caciques, that's the men who ruled indigenous communities, to secure goods, to secure temporary peace, or secure the departure of the invaders, a trade consistently depicted in early modern accounts and prints as a happy affair. But a happy affair it was not. This was a multi-layered international system of deception that condemned children to years of abuse, leading to an adulthood of slavery. The Annals of Tlatelolco, written in Nahuatl, noted that at the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, quote, "Some women escaped from being seized and made sex slaves," that's my phrase, quote, "by putting mud on their faces and dressing in rags." Well, Malinche had no such option. Just 12 years old, she had to survive as best she could, even if that meant giving birth to her rapist's child when she was 14, and then seeing that child taken from her and sent to Spain while she was married off to a man chosen for her by her rapist. That this story was rewritten as a romance in the 19th century, and her role then judged as being traitorous in the 20th century, surely only adds to the indignity and violence that she endured in her short life. To how awful the concept is of presenting all of that as a romance. Seeing through the mythologized Malinche to the enslaved girl of the 1520s helps us to rescue from the erased past the other 19 girls transferred to conquistadors, as well as the thousands of others who suffered similar fates. The point is not just that there's a larger story, but there's also a larger cultural phenomenon. The use of that female allegory to depict America, often scantily clad and sexualized, spread as rapidly as the traditional narrative of the conquest of Mexico. By the 17th century, it was a broadly European trope. And in the late 18th and 19th centuries, Romanticism deepened the metaphor of sexual surrender. The triumph of European civilization over indigenous barbarism was presented as fundamentally gendered, with a romance as the inevitable, irresistible core metaphor of the story. Now, we might recognize the romantic depiction of the conquest of Mexico as a fictional distortion, ripe even for parody. But we're not accustomed to seeing it as a hemispheric cover-up of uncomfortable historical truths, one that resonates in and atop our own Capitol building. There on the left. She's called Freedom. She's on top of the US Capitol. Bountiful, regal America figures may seem harmless, but they may also disguise disturbing histories as much as do those happy depictions of Malinche and other indigenous women delivered into sexual slavery, or paintings of Pocahontas, redeemed by her acceptance of civilization. They matter because the lie of Montezuma's surrender and the metaphor of the sexual romantic surrender of America have supported each other for centuries, and they still resonate today. They matter because Malinche and Pocahontas can still be wielded as insults, even at the level of national and presidential politics. I said there were many reasons why this fake news of Montezuma's surrender has survived for so long. I don't have time to detail them all, and I'm going to talk about a few more, far more briefly than the one I just talked about. So let me just kind of rattle through a few. None of them are nearly as grim and disturbing as the one I was just talking about, don't worry. One is the context in which the surrender lie was first put to paper. That was in 1520, at the absolute low point of the Spanish invasion, when most conquistadors from the expedition were dead. The surrender story was composed by Cortés, possibly by Cortés, I would argue by Cortés and a group of other Spanish captains, and it was intended to act as a kind of alchemy. It was to turn what at that point was Aztec victory into the temporary setback of a rebellion, so that an empire, allegedly once righteously won, could thereby be regained. And that is so often forgotten, that particular context of when it was written. It's assumed that it was somehow this truthful memory and record of events that was put to paper after they had all happened by somebody who was right there, and therefore it's eyewitness and so on. Here are a couple more reasons why this lie has survived. As the decades and centuries passed, the invented surrender story worked its way into Spanish chronicles and then into histories in other languages. For example, a French historian writing in the 1750s, the Abbé Prévost, spotted that the tale was highly suspect, but, he said, it seemed otherwise because it was found in so many books. He then went ahead and repeated it himself. We would call that confirmation bias. Then, as the age of Western imperial expansion reached its apex in the modern centuries, Europe's empires joined by the young United States, all imperial states embraced the fiction or mythology of indigenous welcome, surrender, capitulation, and the acceptance of Western superiority. So sometimes people think, if they have studied this, Captain Cook. So the myths of Cortés and Captain Cook, for example, being taken for gods by the natives, those reinforced each other, while new Protestant and secular ideologies of imperial justification, like the white man's burden, reinforced older Catholic ones, even if they claimed to correct or replace them. But it wasn't only Europeans who had reason to embrace the lie as truth. Montezuma's own ancestors had reason to perpetuate the surrender story through the centuries of Spanish colonialism. This is a wonderful document in the Spanish Imperial Archives. This is a part of a series of letters written to the Spanish king by a nephew of Montezuma in Latin. He wrote not only in Nahuatl and in Spanish, but also spoke and wrote beautifully in Latin. If you're thinking, oh, so the Aztecs spoke Latin? Yeah, right. Okay, so there's the catch. That very fact that it's in Latin should lead you to wonder, oh, there's something else going on here. How did he learn Latin? Who taught him Latin? So therefore, that might make us not jump so much to the conclusion that because this is written by a nephew of Montezuma who lived through the war, it is therefore some kind of eyewitness, true indigenous perspective of what happened. Well, in this letter, Don Pablo Nazareo, as he becomes baptized as, he describes how Montezuma not only surrendered to the Spanish, but that as soon as they arrived, he realized here had come the truth, the true religion, the true faith, and he converted to Christianity immediately. All the other lines of evidence suggest extremely strongly that that did not take place. So why would he write this? Well, the royal dynasty, Montezuma's family, survived as local nobility, maintaining political status, privileges, and wealth, partly by promoting themselves as loyal vassals of the Spanish crown, beginning with the idea of Montezuma's willing embrace of the invaders and their king. Remember, this Spanish king who they're swearing loyalty to never visits. The Spanish king never comes to anywhere in the New World throughout the entire 300 years of Spanish colonial rule. He's very distant. What they're concerned with is their local privileges. So the notion that the surrender, Montezuma's surrender, must be true because indigenous people believed it, was sort of floating around for centuries, but it really became strengthened by the discovery in the late 19th century of something called the Florentine Codex. It's actually not a codex, nor is it Florentine. It was created by a Franciscan friar and ended up in a library in Florence for hundreds of years. In fact, it's still there, and that's why it's called that. It has become increasingly available. It did become increasingly available in the 20th century, and now in the 21st century, the entire thing is online, open access. Anyone can go up there and see. It's really huge. It's 12 pages. It's trilingual, Spanish, Nahuatl, and then a visual accompaniment, kind of a, what we used to call comics, kind of graphic novel version. And to Florentine Codex scholars, when I use the word graphic novel in reference to any part of it, they get all kind of twitchy. The Codex, so-called, contained a version of Montezuma's speech in Nahuatl, repeating the traditional surrender theme, but couched in indigenous terms that scholars widely read as reflecting the true vision of the vanquished. So in this version, Montezuma declares that for generations, the emperors of Mexico have awaited the prophesied return of their ancient sovereign. And now, he supposedly tells Cortés, here in Nahuatl, translating from the Nahuatl, it has come true. You have come. May our lords be arrived in the land. So, 20th century scholars, attempting to see the encounter through the lens of Aztec culture and to give Montezuma agency, as it would have been described in the late 20th century, they reinforced the emperor's status as blameworthy and blind. They embraced the detail that Montezuma identified Cortés with the returning man-god, Quetzalcoatl. See, again, really? Oh, they're waiting for someone to return. There's a returning god of some kind. He's a man and a god, and he's coming back. It's so obvious. Like, how do people not see this? All right. But the ancient Mesoamerican myth was added to the conquest story by Franciscan friars, not Dominicans. They would never have done it. If only the Dominicans had been in charge of the story, right? added by Franciscan friars like Bernardino de Sahagún, who had conceived, compiled, and even created most of the so-called Florentine Codex. No early source identifies Cortés with any Aztec god. No matter, the Quetzalcoatl myth became the solution to the riddle of Montezuma's surrender. All through the 20th century, in Spanish, French, English, Montezuma bowed to the will of the god-ruler Cortés Quetzalcoatl. Thus, the catalogue for Aztecs, wonderful 2002 exhibition in the British Museum, simply expressed the prevailing interpretation when it declared, quote, "The Aztec ruler welcomed Cortés with open arms, mistaking him for the hero king returning from the sea." Right there, that sentence is basically my entire book is designed to convince you that that sentence is wrong in every way. In other words, the traditional narrative of the surrender survived, just dressed in indigenous clothing. All right, so the significance of the meeting then is not just its status as one of, let's say, history's great milestone encounters. It is the persistent dominance of the Cortés-based depiction of the event, complete with this big fat fib at its heart. The traditional narrative of the entire conquest of Mexico, the story we thought we knew as true, effectively stems from that account of the meeting. That's like a domino in the middle of a pattern that is the traditional narrative of the conquest. And we flip that domino over, they all slowly fall down, and the entire traditional narrative collapses. If we rethink this meeting, maybe we can rethink the Aztecs, the conquistadors, the war between them, even the entire history of conquest and colonization in the Americas. More than that, we might ponder how the dominant traditional narrative of the conquest of Mexico is a triumphal inevitability, legitimized by a providential surrender, echoes through the centuries, through all the European conquest that underpinned the global triumph of the West, resonating in modern multimedia renderings of that grand narrative. I'm kind of leaping the shark here, whatever that expression is, so bear with me. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Harry Potter. Think of their racialized universes and the cosmic victory of good over evil, civilization over barbarism. Think of the implications of this. It has proved possible for one man's lie to become an official deception used to justify generations of warfare, appropriated for centuries to help justify wars of conquest and colonization that have slaughtered or enslaved hundreds of millions of people, underpinning the world we live in today. What is there to stop the lie being perpetuated for another 500 years? Or another lie, another alternative fact taking its place? What is there to stop it? It's you. That's what's going to stop it, not us. We're too old. It's up to these guys. All right, I promised I would work my way back to lions and tigers, which is where we're going now. So let's turn to these monstrous doubles, because the distorted depiction of the meeting as a surrender creates a winner and a loser, each dependent on the other for their image to be whole. Cortés's own account of himself as a winner was a cornerstone of the traditional narrative of the Spanish-Aztec War, but another stone was laid by, that's Cortés up there. It's not a portrait of this guy, but there's his book. This guy's name doesn't matter so much as Francisco López de Gómara. He wrote a book in 1552. He was paid by Cortés's son to write a book about the war. He called it La Conquista de México. That's where the phrase comes from. We still call this the conquest of Mexico after the title of this book. The book is, I would argue provocatively, that it should be read as historical fiction. It exaggerates and distorts and turns into such a massive and absurd legend, Cortés. It's essentially a hagiography of Cortés. It sold out 22 editions in Italian, French, and English by the end of the 16th century. Not even talking about its history in Spanish. It permanently established the war as the conquest of Mexico by a brilliant and God-blessed Cortés, retold repeatedly with the same details ever since. The story has Cortés quitting the study of law in Spain because he was soon disgusted with an academic life which did not suit his ardent and restless genius. It's also a line from the biography of Father Ulrich. He fulfills his destiny and conquers the Aztec Empire with just a few hundred men, deploying a mix of violence with skillful diplomacy. Montezuma's surrender is a reflection of that Cortesian genius in the official story. These hagiographies have yet to cease. There's new ones coming out every year. He's been Caesar. There's an entire book just describing him to Julius Caesar, comparing him favorably with Julius Caesar. He's been Julius Caesar, hero, founding father of a nation. The Franciscans, back to the Franciscans again, virtually deified him. This valiant captain, wrote one of them, was chosen by God as a new Moses to free the Indian people. This was a theme that was elemental to the Cortés legend. The Spanish poet Gabriel Lasso de la Vega asserted that Cortés and Luther were born on the same day, not coincidentally. In other words, this was part of God's plan, if you can follow that through. See, Luther is going to bring people away from the true faith, so God's plan is to have Cortés is to match those numbers by having him bring indigenous people converted to Catholicism. They actually weren't born on the same day. They weren't even born in the same year. Well, doesn't matter. Another alternative fact, repeated dozens, if not hundreds of times for centuries. Persuasion is at the heart of all conquest literature, and this particular heart has been infused with fresh blood for centuries. Yes, there's a less flattering side to the Cortés legend. You can see that not very flattering portrait there by Diego Rivera. But it's mostly a modern Mexican phenomenon tied to Mexican history, independence, Mexican Revolution, the indigenismo movement, with Cortés as a grim symbol of colonialism. The negative portrait has never undermined or upended the legend, because it easily serves as the reverse side to the same coin. So the bold, brilliant strategist is also the cold pragmatist who commits atrocities in the war. The larger-than-life hero can also be the womanizer who strangles his first Spanish wife when she objects to his first household in Mexico being full of his concubines. It's an accusation that's made and an investigation that lasts years into whether he committed that murder. So Cortés as a macho man is an image that can contain most elements of his traditional portrait. One as recognizably positive to 16th century Europeans as it might be recognizably offensive to, say, 21st century Mexicans. The truth is that the Cortés legend has served as smoke and mirrors to disguise the grim, messy reality of a war in which dozens of Spanish captains and as many Nahuatl leaders vied for survival and local control. The young Cortés lived an ordinary life, an ordinary settler's life in the Caribbean for 15 years, a notary, cattle rancher, a trader in enslaved indigenous Tainos. He gave one of them his mother's name and had a child with her and later brought them to Mexico. This is the man who would eventually be portrayed thus, the fat Cortés, as I call him. Cortés never actually initiated a single successful conquest campaign. Not even the one in Mexico. He did not initiate that. He was a spiteful mediocrity, a duplicitous frontman, or rather a backseat driver. His instinct for self-preservation inspired what one Nahuatl chronicler, Ixtlilxochitl, to write that Cortés proved what they say about all cruel men being cowards. Despite ubiquitous assertions that 400 conquistadors conquered the Aztecs, I saw that even this morning in newspaper articles coming out because of being exactly the 500-year anniversary. 400 Spaniards conquered an empire of millions. Despite these assertions, I discovered in the course of my research that close to 3,000 Spaniards came to Mexico during the war, of whom 2/3 died during it. Only a handful died decades later of old age in Spain. One historian even claims there was only one who managed that feat. That's Cortés. So perhaps this portrait painted by an indigenous artist, in fact, in the 17th century. So perhaps this portrait unintentionally captures the spirit of a leader who posed rather than fought, who took the limelight but not the slings and arrows. The conquistador claim that Mexico was conquered in 1521 was pure spin. The conquest began in 1521. In the 1520s, New Spain existed in name only. The new settlers were few and bitterly divided. The Aztec Empire was largely still intact, now centered on Texcoco, whose king, Ixtlilxochitl, had used the war to displace Tenochtitlan's dominance of the imperial alliance. On the other side of the great volcanoes, Tlaxcala had similarly carved out some imperial space of its own. Only over many decades would the surviving members of the Aztec royal family rebuild Tenochtitlan as Mexico City and collude with the Spanish settler government to stitch the old empire back together and expand its reach across Mesoamerica. But the initial transition was not yet the shift to colonial rule, but merely a change in rulership at the center. The message was, the empire survives, keep paying tribute. So Cortez's control in the 1520s was thus an illusion. He was obliged to mimic Montezuma, to play the role of his successor, complete with a court and household staffed with concubines and other women, including Malinche, and including women who'd been part of Montezuma's household. One was the emperor's senior daughter, Tecuichpo Ixcaxochitzin, christened Doña Isabel Moctezuma. She was briefly married to both of her father's successors, Cuitláhuac and Cuauhtémoc, then transferred to Cortés in 1521, as if he were next in line to the throne. Despite being formally married to a series of Spaniards, she bore Cortés a child, evidence, according to one of Cortés's enemies, that he lived like a heathen, not a Christian. In other words, like an Aztec. For in the chaos of the 1520s, Cortés had no choice but to become a Montezuma impersonator, and a pale one at that. So where does that leave our understanding of Montezuma himself? In the traditional narrative, Montezuma is so unnerved by the Spaniards, by the seeming relevance of this Quetzalcoatl prophecy, that he panics and surrenders. As the Cortés legend developed, so did Montezuma's reputation as a cowardly failure whose surrender legitimized Spanish conquest, but also reflected the superstitious, barbaric weakness of the emperor and the civilization that produced him. For 5 centuries, historians have been judging Montezuma as timorous, cowardly, deluded, foolish. Yet, Montezuma also seemed to be the powerful, authoritarian ruler of an aggressively expanding empire. This is an image from a wonderful and important manuscript that's just over the road down the road in the John Carter Brown Library. An emperor willing to lead armies himself, execute captives with his own hands. So the effect was to turn Montezuma into a nonsensical contradiction, one that defied visual representation. And there's a lot of portraits of Montezuma over the course of the 5 centuries, which don't make any sense at all. They don't look the same as each other. They don't really tell us anything about Montezuma. They tell us a great deal, again, like those other images I showed you of the meeting, about how people are perceiving the other, the Oriental other, indigenous other as being Orientalized and so on. So there's a whole history in there of early modern European art and culture. It doesn't really tell us anything about Montezuma himself. And actually, just based on the style, trace one's way across the early modern period up into the 19th century, rather than being taken back into the 16th century. Right? On the one hand, Montezuma was a monster, a ritual murderer. These are quotes from books about him in the 20th century. Yet at the same time, he's also a pathetic figure compared to the saintly Las Casas. You knew Las Casas was going to get in here somewhere. Here he is. Compared to the saintly Las Casas and Cortés the Killer, these are the covers of a wonderful series of books, the Biblioteca del Niño, published in Mexico at the turn of the 20th century. So these are books for children, to tell them about, to Mexican children, tell them about their own history. So, how might we see Montezuma differently? I'm telling you that this contradiction and this nonsense doesn't make any sense. First, we must see Aztec civilization differently. The next slide is the cover of the best-selling book in the English language about the Aztecs. This sold more copies than all the scholarly books about the Aztecs put together. it only makes sense, it only works because as soon as you see that image in that cartoon, you chuckle because whether you realize it or not, there's a cultural reference that is embedded in your head that makes this sensible. So, despite the more sophisticated understanding of the Aztecs that's developed in recent decades, the prevailing view since the 1520s has been to see Aztec culture as a dark, bloodthirsty one, tainted by superstition, violence, even cannibalism. Montezuma has been tarnished with this same brush. But there are ways to look afresh at the evidence that's been in front of us all along. Such work is being done by a wide array of scholars in Mexico and elsewhere, and one can only hope that it works its way into the larger perception of the Aztecs sooner rather than later. For now, I'd like to suggest one piece of evidence, a dot that will lead us back to Cortez's tiger. Let's return to the Nuremberg map, as it's called, printed in Nuremberg in 1524, of Tenochtitlan. And despite the stylized way in which Montezuma's palaces are represented, his royal compounds on the map, one can see evidence of a network of gardens, museums, palaces, and zoos. In cages, courtyards, and buildings designed to facilitate observation and study, the emperor kept artifacts of all kinds from across the empire, from weaponry to textiles to featherwork. A crew of gardeners tended plants and herbs, organized by category, and a set of zoos held reptiles, songbirds, birds of prey, mammals of all kinds, including human beings with genetic deformities. Here then was a culture obsessed not with violence and death, but with order and life, with the ways in which order might be imposed on the disorder of life. Here was an emperor preoccupied not with cutting out hearts, but with acquiring, organizing, and observing the natural life forms and objects of the world he ruled. In other words, Montezuma was a collector. The key to his worldview was not the blood-drenched altar at the top of the pyramid temple of the war god Huitzilopochtli, but the zoological complex that was spread across his royal compound. So, if Montezuma did not surrender to the Spaniards, why did he welcome them into Tenochtitlan exactly 500 years ago today? Because he was the undisputed ruler of his universe, a king deeply steeped in the rules of ritual and etiquette, obliged to welcome the foreigners with a speech that was concomitant with forms of Nahuatl address appropriate to Montezuma's imperial status and the formality of the event. The key to understanding Montezuma's speech is the corpus of texts in which classical Nahuatl was preserved in the early colonial period. So these are records of how the language was spoken in Montezuma's day and under what circumstances. The circumstance of the meeting required an elaborate, reverential, gracious, self-deprecating speech of welcome. So the purpose of Montezuma's speech was to ritually display the emperor's majesty, to reassure the Spaniards that they were guests, that they were not new acquisitions to his collection. Because, of course, acquisitions is what they really were. As a collector, the emperor sought to add Cortés and his compatriots to the zoo. His strategy was designed to control the Spaniards, to weaken but not destroy them or drive them away, to draw them into the city so that they could be collected. Montezuma was not afraid of the invaders, he was hunting them. Once acquired, they were housed within the royal compound in the palace of the emperor's predecessor, adjacent to other collection sites. And over the next 6 months, Montezuma treated the Spaniards as if they were the newest and most interesting acquisition in his zoos. He displayed them, observed them, learned from them. Where he miscalculated was not realizing that he was arguably more civilized than they were. Like his lions and tigers, Montezuma's Spaniards couldn't really be tamed. They would eventually turn on their zookeeper, humiliate and murder him, and lay the foundation for 5 centuries of disrespect. The zoos, meanwhile, were destroyed during the 1521 siege of Tenochtitlan. On one of the larger zoo sites, a vast Franciscan convent was laid out, and a handful of its structures still survive. We have one left here. Torre Latinoamericana is the corner, so the zoo extended all the way along here, and then the same distance again and the same distance back in. And that vast network of blocks where the zoo was similarly a vast network of the Franciscan convent. The ponds and orchards of the zoo were soon resurrected by the Franciscans, but the animals were replaced by small livestock. The exotic fauna reduced or scattered even as far as Spain. One cannot help but wonder whether the Nahua slaves and servants who toiled where the zoo once flourished saw their world as marked more by continuity or by change. What would they have made of the Cortés of modern legend, or the scapegoated Montezuma? One wonders too what Aztecs would have made of the Spanish village of Castilleja de la Cuesta, had they been able to visit it, as I did some years ago doing the research for this book. Why? Well, as you could tell by my little introduction there at the beginning with Columbia, Tennessee, any excuse to go any little corner of the world and research for a book I took. Well, Cortés died in 1547 in this little village. I looked in vain for any kind of commemorative plaque or monument or any kind of mention of him there in the town that would be of any interest. Eventually, I gave up. It was a hot day. I retreated to a local bar where, to my amazement, I found this evidence of the impact of the conquistador and his encounter with the Aztec emperor. I'm not making this up. I wished I'd had a few Aztec warriors with me to tell me their version of the meeting of November the 8th, 1519. Well, together we dropped €1 coins into the machine, hoping they would win us Montezuma's missing treasure. Better yet, I wish I could talk to some of the Aztecs who sailed as slaves to Spain in 1527 to ask them what they thought of Montezuma's zoo, of its destruction by the Spaniards, and to ask them whatever happened to Cortez's tiger. Thank you.
We have some time for some questions. Who would like to ask Dr. Restall, Professor Restall, some questions about lions and tigers and conquistadors or any other theme? Just raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone back to you. Okay.
Before I ask my question, are we sure that no student wants to ask a question as customary? If not, I'm afraid that by way of debunking Cortés, you have romanticized Montezuma. I mean, by your own showing, he kept human beings as zoo animals. No.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean,
there are many traps in trying to persuade you to see things differently, and they're particularly, the traps are more obvious in the course of an hour-long talk, and is one of the reasons why the book is as long as it is, right? There's 3 chapters in the book that handle this thorny question of how we look at the Aztecs and Montezuma. In order partly to avoid that kind of thing. You know, to have the time to say, let's look at him a little bit differently, but let's not push the pendulum too far in the other direction. So this sort of somewhat rhetorical or polemical way in which I have tried to kind of flip them around, right? And denigrate Cortés and kind of lionize Montezuma is a deliberate way of kind of pushing the pendulum out to an extreme in order to kind of force the debate forward and to get you to think a little bit differently. And there's an accompanying trap is also to anticipate what may also be in your head or that of others is to turn the Spaniards into black legend demons, right? To sort of somehow seem to be denigrating not just conquistador culture, but Spanish imperial culture of the entire colonial era. That, of course, is not really the ultimate goal. But by making some extreme statements, the idea is to kind of force people to rethink their assumptions and to question the stereotypes so that we can end up with a more kind of balanced picture in the middle. I mean, I'm happy to talk endlessly, debate over the coming years what Montezuma was really like. And I think that if we get to a point where where we want to concede that he was no more the kind of chap that you want to invite to dinner than Cortés, and meet your family members, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't change the kind of the core argument that I'm trying to make to do with his surrender.
Next question. We got a question over here. Any students have questions? We try to give the students a chance to do questions first. Any students? Okay. Can take a question next. Any students?
Could you tell us some of the sources that you used for reconstructing the story? I was wondering, as you were going along how one story has held center stage, and I was curious, well, how did you reconstruct it?
Yeah, there's 100 pages of notes in the book, and so I can kind of ramble on for a lot about the sources, so to kind of be quick. There's really 3 categories, and the first category is the sources that everybody knows, the ones that people have used before, the ones that are printed and published. Bernal Diaz, for example, there are dozens of editions of that. Probably everybody in this room, whether they realize it or not, has read some piece of that account. So the first step is to revisit all of the sources that have been used before and to try and see if there are ways that they can be read from different angles and different perspectives, to see what they really say by going through the popular translations and going back to the original documents themselves. That only takes us so far. Then the second step is going deeper into the sources in the 16th century themselves or itself. So, for example, there is a 6,000-page legal investigation that was carried out into Cortés's performance as Governor General in the 1520s after the Spanish-Aztec War. It has never been published. You have to go to the archives. There are bits and pieces of it are published with various transcriptions and translations, most of which are very flawed. If you want to go and read the whole 6,000 pages, you have to go to the archives in Seville, where they won't let you look at the original because they'll say it's on microfilms. Then you have to wade through the microfilm. And after you've been there for a few weeks and they realize you're not a crazy person, and you point out look how bad this microfilm image is, I can't read this, and you demonstrate that you can actually read the handwriting of the 1520s, then they let you look at the original, and then you begin to understand why people haven't mined this source to the degree that they might have, because they can pick up Bernal Diaz in English in the Penguin edition, and there I've got the story right there. People don't always have the resources and the time to spend weeks in the archives in Spain, and that investigation is not easy to decode as well, because it's a legal investigation structured around a questionnaire, set of questions that are put to multiple witnesses over time. So that's just one example of a source which, for the reasons I've just explained, has not been used as much as it might have been. The third type of source takes us out of the 16th century. And that by going out of the 16th century was when I realized that I could actually write this book and I could say something that was different. Because at first, looking at those first 2 types of sources, I thought, I'm wasting my time. I'm not going to write this, just repeat the same old story. I'm only going to do this if I think I can say something different, or if I find something different. If I thought, the traditional narrative is basically right, so there's nothing to say. By looking at things that were written in multiple languages, in multiple media, by which I mean not just history books or chronicles, but plays, operas, visual things like the display there and the dome in the U.S. Capitol. By looking at all these different sources over the course of those centuries, I realized that there was a story that had survived and grown for multiple reasons that were nothing to do with what actually happened at the time. And that allowed me to then make an argument in the book that this surrender was not a surrender, and this is why it matters. What matters is the lie. That's the key thing that matters. It's not that Montezuma met Cortés. It's that it's been presented as a surrender for 500 years, and it wasn't a surrender. And that other set of evidence gave me that opportunity. And the place where I first got that idea was the John Carter Brown Library right here in Providence. Because they have an unprecedented collection of written materials published in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century on what John Carter Brown called Americana. So it's on the history of the Americas. And it was, reading things like that, English plays of the 17th century, Dutch histories written in the 17th century of what the Spaniards were doing, the librettos from operas from the 18th century. And then following those, saying, they've only got a couple of librettos. Were there more operas? I went to the British Library, and in the music manuscript collection in the British Library in London, there they all are. It turns out this was a big deal. They were writing Montezuma and Cortés operas all through the 18th and 19th century. Nobody has thought to study those or think about what they might mean or how they might be connected to some kind of a larger history. And what they show is many reasons to do with what's happening in the 18th, 19th century. People are invested in this particular story, in turning this lie into something that explains and justifies the way that the history of the world and the Atlantic world has developed. Does that answer your question? You probably wanted me to talk more about 16th century stuff. I can come back to that.
Any students? Any questions from the students? Okay, well, here first, okay.
Thank you very much for the talk. I just want to ask about the mural in the Capitol, where it shows the Aztecs and it has the large Aztec calendar behind them.
Yeah.
Was that very familiar to people at that time? I mean, that's just around when photography starting. I wonder how, a normal American going to the Capitol, would they realize what that was? Obviously, the artist thought so, but
yeah. Well,
it's, I think more recently that's become known and sort of common. I just found it interesting that.
So when you say a normal American, you mean like a regular visitor? I'm not sure, but any of the students here are contemplating going to get advanced degrees in history and thinking about why would you do that and so on. You'll love this. So that image that I showed you interested me enough that I began some correspondence with the architect of the Capitol, who is an art historian who has an office in the Capitol, who's responsible for, managing the hundreds of pieces of artwork, sculptures, and paintings and so that are in the Capitol. To cut a long story short, a year later, I'm on a 3-month fellowship in the Capitol building. So now I'm actually being paid. Yes, that's what's amazing about our job, not only by my university, but also by the U.S. government, to wander around the U.S. Capitol building with a little security badge. No one can do that except congressmen and women and their retinue of interns and so on. But there was me just walking around, looking at studying the art and so on. And in the course of doing that and delving into the archives of the Capitol, I discovered that, yes, there was an intense fascination in the 19th century with all things to do with Mexico, particularly shortly before and especially stemming from and after the Mexican-American War. And the idea that, not the idea, but the question raised and discussed and debated, should we invade Mexico and incorporate the entire thing into the United States, which many people believed was what should be done. And part of that discussion as well, is that part of our civilizing mission? Mexicans like a bunch of barbarians, and so therefore as the great republic and the banner of freedom and so on, should we take that down there? And it's a sort of secular version of the religious justifications of earlier centuries, right? Saving people's souls. We have to conquer indigenous people so we can save their souls. So pieces of art like that are part of the discussion, and it's now in a museum in Mexico City. But in the 19th century, it's dug up in the end of the 18th century. It's found at the end of the 18th century and dug up, and it just is leaning against a pillar in the cathedral. So anyone can wander in or out and see it. And American visitors would go down and write diaries and write about it, and many would sort of do drawings of it. And they're quite commonplace as kind of illustrations in travel accounts. You know, you'll see Mexican sort of market women selling their wares all around this calendar stone in the cathedral, right? And that was kind of this image of, look what Mexico is like. And that reinforced the idea that Spaniards didn't really successfully civilize the barbarous Aztecs, that the whole place is still essentially uncivilized. But we can go in there and we can save it and we can civilize it. And not to keep talking about, but I think that resonates today, and you know, not to be sort of overly provocative, but I think it resonates today in all kinds of ways. Yes.
The copy of the portrait of Cortez that you visited in the hospital in Mexico City, do they acknowledge it as a copy? Because you said you theorized that it was actually stolen.
No. So, first of all, you can't, it's not on public display, right? Secondly, Cortez is a thorny subject in Mexico. There aren't statues to Cortez and monuments to him and things like that. So, there's a outside on one of the exterior walls of that church, that's part of the hospital. There's one of these murals that depicts the meeting, and if you at some point were able to pick up a copy of this Montezuma Met Cortez book, there's a color section in the middle with all the images, and the very end of that, the last image, is a photograph of that mural on that wall, and someone has written on it, "Viva Tenochtitlan, genocidio," genocide. So if you make it publicly known that there's an original 18th century colonial period portrait of Cortez in the director's office, and people are allowed to come in and out, it's just a matter of time before that portrait, that painting gets stolen or vandalized or something. So they're not telling you anything about it.
Okay, I am probably being hopelessly flat-footed and literal-minded here, but you say surrender is an inaccurate description of this meeting, which you've told us on a particular date, November 8th. What would be an accurate description? I mean, what in fact how much do we know what did in fact happen between them? I think you showed a manuscript that might have indicated perhaps Montezuma was using sort of conventional, polite terms of welcome that could have been misinterpreted in that direction. But can you tell us a little more about this moment in history?
Yeah, I think welcome is a better word. It's a diplomatic moment, right? It's not a moment of invasion and not a moment of victory and surrender. It's a diplomatic moment. The Spaniards are welcomed and they're brought into the city, and they're there in that city for almost 6 months, during which time there is almost no violence, very little violence in the city or actually elsewhere in Mexico. So the war has begun in the spring, in that there has been warfare and military encounters and battles and so on in central Mexico within the empire that spring. But after that moment, from November through to the following spring, summer, it's a kind of a phony war or a lull, right? Because there actually has not been a resolution of the presence of these foreigners. A little fact that I not uncovered but realized in the course of doing the research that might help you to see what this moment really looked like. In all of these depictions, in the murals, in the descriptions and so on, one gets the impression that here you have an invading army of Spaniards. Yes, they're outnumbered greatly, but that's part of what is supposedly so amazing and even miraculous about this invasion. A few hundred Spaniards conquering an empire of millions of people. But at that moment, when Cortés and his fellow captains are at the front of let's call them an army, okay? They're not really an army, but this invading army. Of all of those people who are walking up that causeway to the gates of Tenochtitlan, where Montezuma is waiting and delivers his speech and welcomes them in, less than 5% of them are Spaniards. Spaniards are only numbering a couple of hundred. There are some people of African descent, 100 or 200 maybe, somewhere in that region. Some of them are slaves, some of them are free, some of them are sub-Saharan African, some are mixed African, North African. They're part of the Spanish settlement enterprise in the Caribbean, but the vast majority of them are indigenous. And they are a mixture of Tainos, indigenous people from the Caribbean who've been brought by the Spaniards as slaves, as servants, some Totonacs and other Mesoamericans from other parts of the empire who've come in, and Nahuatl speakers, or Nahuas, are the same ethnic group as the Aztecs themselves. In other words, once we kind of look at the demographics of it and look at the numbers, it starts to look very different. Now, all of a sudden, we have an area of millions of people which has now been consumed by war and political instability, that it's been catalyzed by the presence of foreign invaders, rather than an empire of millions that has simply been invaded and conquered by those foreign invaders. And at any point during the war, it's not clear, even right after that war, it's not clear what that instability is going to lead to. As people are struggling to control the outcome, anyone who studies war, the cliches about war, the first casualty is truth, the second casualty is control, right? That there's a constant struggle for control. The traditional narrative has Cortés masterfully controlling everything. I think if we remove him from that and imagine he's not in control of everything, then the events that take place make a little bit more sense, because you can see how there's chaos and there are different players, Spanish and indigenous, who are trying to jostle to make that war end up and that instability end up with them being in charge. The Aztec Empire is sometimes called the Triple Alliance because there were 3 city-states that dominated. But they weren't. I don't like the word Triple Alliance or the phrase Triple Alliance because it implies a kind of equality, and they weren't equal. Tenochtitlan was definitely at the top. Texcoco, that's on the banks of the lake. If you probably know the image, but if you remember the image there with Tenochtitlan on the island on the banks of the lake, Texcoco is number 2, and then Tlacopan, now it's Tacuba, is number 3. At the end of that war, that hierarchy has been reversed at the top, and Texcoco is at the top, because Texcoco wasn't besieged and largely destroyed. The ruler of Texcoco has allied himself with the Spaniards. I think from his point of view, the ruler of Texcoco has managed to use the war to promote his city-state and expand his city-state's control over the valley on that side of the lake. And he's used the Spaniards to do that. And for us to say, well, he's deluded because the war didn't result in 300 years of Texcoco dominated Aztec Empire. It resulted in 300 years of Spanish colonial rule. That's us using hindsight to change what events look like in the 1520s. I think in 1521, that is not apparent and obvious at all, and that the decisions that people are making during the war are very much understandable if they are based on local attempts by local rulers to achieve some kind of control within the chaos of this war in order to promote their interests as rulers of their dynastic family and of their city-state. So when I give you that 5% statistic, that raises a whole bunch of questions that then in the course of answering them get us further and further away from that traditional narrative and help us to understand a little bit. There's some skepticism that I'm sensing here, which I like a lot. I would encourage you to read the book, and the book is designed to try to persuade you to think of something differently, and my absolute favorite readers are people who already know something about this, and maybe they're a little resistant, and then some of the arguments they're not going to buy into, and that's great, and then It's really great when you don't buy into some of them, but you do. But you are convinced by others. Either way, I hope it's worth the battle in your head.
Thank you very much, Dr. Restall. Thank you.